Hello everyone. Today I have with me Dr. JP Moreland, who is a philosopher. So welcome Dr. Moreland, and thank you so much for coming on to my channel.
Lucas, it's wonderful to be with you.
So Dr. Moreland has written a range of books and articles on the philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, metaphysics, theology, and the interface between these. He's also passionate to equip Christians to ground their faith in a firm intellectual foundation, and has co-planted 3 churches. One of the books Dr. Moreland has written is called The Soul, How We Know It's Real and Why It Matters. And the soul is what we will be talking about in this conversation, especially with a view on the question of why it still makes complete sense to affirm the existence of the soul, even in the light of the latest neuroscientific discoveries. And so what you will come away with from this conversation is a greater understanding and hopefully a greater sense of confidence about how to properly evaluate the relationship between the soul and neuroscience. So let's get started. Dr. Moreland, maybe for a start, just a couple of definitions. How do you define the soul and how do you define the mind? What is a person and how do these terms relate to each other?
A soul is an immaterial substance, and by substance I mean, let's just say thing. The soul is an immaterial substance that has consciousness and animates the body. So that's what a soul is. It has consciousness and it animates the body. Now the soul has compartments in it, and those compartments are called faculties. And there is a compartment that contains thoughts and beliefs. There's another compartment that contains visual sensations, another that contains auditory sensations, another compartment that contains my active powers to choose one thing or another, another compartment that contains my feelings and emotions. Now, each of those compartments would be called a faculty. And so the mind is a faculty of the soul. It is that compartment of the soul that contains thoughts, beliefs, and the powers of reasoning. Not all souls have minds. A very simple animal's soul, which let's just say a frog, there is evidence that the frog does have consciousness and reacts to sensations, but there's no evidence that engages in modus ponens or logical deliberation or reasoning of any sort. A person is a soul of a certain kind. Now, what kind? A person is a soul that contains a range of abilities like a well-developed human person. Now, I say well-developed not because I think children aren't fully persons, but I'm trying to distinguish that from someone who through damage is completely unable to think. I still think they're persons, but I don't want to get into that. So the way you define that is you take a paradigm case. You take a clear case of a person. Everybody would agree, even if we're not sure what one is, that's a person. Mm-hmm. And what you say is a person is a soul that has at least the powers of that. So embodiment is not essential to personhood. God is a person. Vulcans, if there were such things, could be persons. Angels are persons. I am an embodied person, but I will exist when I die in a disembodied state. So my body is not essential to my identity. So that's how I would define those for you.
Okay, thank you. Now, I want to get right into the thick of it. We are constantly told that, the discoveries of neuroscience prove that the soul is a myth. And I guess what's interesting is that the claims comes with the fundamental assumption that science, which is the inquiry into the physical realm, can inform us about something that is by definition not physical. And so my question is, what authority does neuroscience actually have to inform us about the soul?
It has absolutely nothing to say about it. Nothing. I spoke at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, which houses thousands of research scientists the government pays to do research on a number of things. And this was, I delivered a lecture to about 130 top research biologists and neuroscientists, most of them unbelievers. And I spent an hour and 15 minutes and then followed that with 45 Q&A. And I defended two theses. The first one is that when it comes to the questions about the ontological status of consciousness and its possessor, neuroscience is silent on those questions. It is outside the methodology of science to say anything about it. Secondly, when you take a look at the philosophical arguments for consciousness and the possessor being immaterial, they are far stronger than the arguments for physicalism, that I'm my brain or my body or something of that sort. I got no intelligent pushback. Okay. The questions that I did get asked were sort of like freshmen in college. Scientists are not trained to deal with the real issues, which are all philosophical and theological. They have nothing to do with science. Let me tell you an example of this. Two or more theories are empirically equivalent if they all entail or imply exactly the same observational data. What that means is that no empirical observation can count in favor of one relative to the others because they all imply exactly the same set of observations. Okay. Now, what we've learned is that there's a group of neurons in the brain called mirror neurons. And if they're damaged, you can't feel empathy for another person. Now, how do we explain that? Well, there are three empirically equivalent theories that equally explain those data. Number one, strict physicalism, namely that consciousness is nothing but physical states in the brain, and the possessor of consciousness is the brain itself. That will explain that. Number two, mere property dualism. That's the view that consciousness is in no way physical. It is clearly immaterial, but the possessor of consciousness is the brain itself. So the brain has different kinds of properties. It has the properties of matter, but it also has the properties of consciousness that are immaterial. That's explanation number two. There, the relationship between mirror neurons and a feeling of empathy is cause and effect. It's not identity. They're not the same thing. As the physicalist says, one causes the other. The neurons cause the feeling of empathy. If they don't work, you can't have the feeling. The third explanation is not only is a feeling of empathy different from the firing of a mirror neuron. The first is immaterial, the second is physical, but the possessors of the two are different. The states of consciousness, like a feeling of empathy, belongs and is possessed by the soul or the self, and the firing of mirror neurons belong to the brain. So you have different states or properties and different possessors. Now, all three of those, but there's a cause-effect relationship there. So they're all three empirically equivalent. Now, what neuroscience can do then, what it cannot do, is to decide which of those three are true. What it can do, and this is what we love about it, is it can increasingly study and tighten up the details between causal relationships and dependency relationships between conscious states in the soul and brain states in the brain. Whereas we used to know in Aquinas' day that if you get hit on the head, you're going to lose your ability to think well. Now we know specifically what region of the brain needs to be damaged so you can't have memories or think well. But that's got nothing to do with anything, except that might help us develop surgical procedures to help people get better. May I say one other thing, Lucas? And it's like this. Imagine a person in a car in the driver's seat with the seatbelt locked and the doors of the car locked from the outside, and he can't get out of the driver's seat. This person's ability to get around town is going to be dependent on whether the car works. If the car's in working order, he can go anywhere he wants to. If the steering wheel breaks so that it will only turn left and not right, his motion will be limited. If the carburetor shuts down entirely, then he won't be able to move at all. But that doesn't prove that he's the car. It is consistent with that evidence that he is the driver that is in the car, and if he could get out of the car, he could move around even though the car's broken. And in near-death experiences, which, by the way, are beyond reasonable doubt, and I can argue that if you'd like, there are clear examples of where people think and they're aware they have sensations and experiences, and they don't have a brain or a body whatsoever. Their bodies and brains are absolutely dead with no brain waves. So that's why neuroscience has nothing to do with it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we will get into near-death experiences later on, but I guess I just want to clarify. So you're essentially saying that, as we have these cases of, again, people with a damaged brain losing memories or losing some ability to speak or to remember loved ones and whatnot, all that this is telling us is that there is some sort of correlation or causation between the physical brain and the mind, but that is not the same thing as the brain being the mind. Is this the case you're putting forward?
Well put. Absolutely well put. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I want to move on to something, I guess, that may relate to that, which is the split brain phenomenon. And that's often claimed as evidence for the physicalist position. Now, I'd like you to clarify to our viewers what exactly is that split brain phenomenon and what does it really tell us about the brain and the mind?
Well, under certain very specifically controlled laboratory conditions, if a person's corpus callosum, which is a set of nerves that tie the two hemispheres together, if that is cut in half, so your brain, your left and right hemispheres are now unconnected, and if something is put between the patient's eyes so that the left eye cannot see what's going on to the right of that screen, and the right eye cannot see what's going on to the left of the screen, what you will have is that the person will manifest behavior that looks like you have two different people that are reacting in different ways. So if you have I don't know, car keys, where car is on the left side and keys is on the right side, then the person, since the left eye communicates with the right hemisphere, they may be aware of car, but they might not, that part of them might not be aware of keys, whereas the left side would. And so you get different kinds of behavior. Now what is supposed to follow from that? Some will claim that what this shows is that the self has been cut in two. It's been divided. So it must be spatially extended. And the best way to explain how you can divide one person into two is by saying that we're our brains, because the brain was clearly divided. So that's the way the argument goes. The argument is actually a failure, and it's increasingly been shown, and it's even being accepted by those who don't believe in the soul as a failure as an argument for the following reasons. When that happens to a patient, when the precise circumstances of the experience are removed so that the partition between their eyes is taken away, they behave as unified selves all over again. In fact, they can actually, in surgery, have their head bandaged and be sent home while their brains is still split down the middle and the two hemispheres are isolated because they want it, maybe that'll help with their epileptic seizures, and they go home and live an ordinary life. There's no disunity whatsoever. Now, look, it seems very difficult to believe that removing a partition between this person's eyeballs creates a new unified self. That just doesn't make any sense at all to me. So a better explanation would be that they were always unified selves, but the experimental conditions in some way disturbed that self's functioning. And that's exactly what we've discovered. Tim Bain, who is, and I've debated with him in the literature, I've critiqued his views, but some of the things he says I think are spot on. He's probably the world's leading expert on this. And he argues that split brain phenomena don't prove anything at all. In fact, the best explanation for it is what's called the switch brain hypothesis. And what that means is that the single self that is still present switches so rapidly between using the left hemisphere and then the right, then the left and the right, that when they're employing the left, they don't remember what they were aware of when they were using the right hemisphere, and conversely, so that their independent behavior is due to not remembering what they were aware of with the other hemisphere. The shifts take place so quickly. Good experiment of this is if you open your eyes and close the left and the right, then the left and the right, you see slightly different visual fields. They overlap, but they're a little bit different. Now, suppose that when you did that they weren't integrated somehow, and that your optic nerve was severed, so that when you did that, you weren't aware at the same time that you were doing the back and forth, and you sort of identified with one eye and then the other eye, and you went back and forth. Well, it'd be the same thing. So really all this proves is that when your brain is severed, if you're in your body, it doesn't work the way your self needs it to work to function normally. And so you over-identify with one hemisphere and the information you're receiving from it. It's an all or nothing kind of thing, rather than you're aware of both coming to you at the same time. So no self is divided, it's functioning that is divided.
Okay, so I guess, again, just to clarify, going back to your definitions, because you're making the argument that a person is not essentially or doesn't have to be embodied in order to be a person. However, when the self or when the soul is embodied, it acts differently, or it is restrained than when it is not embodied. Is this what this is about?
And while I'm in my body, Lucas, my conscious functioning is dependent on my organs. That's why I have a body in the first place. I mean, so if you put my eyes out, my eyes don't see anything. I do. I'm a person. I see things. But I need eyes as a vehicles to see. The same thing as thinking. One of the world's leading experts came to my university a few years ago. He's published so much on memory, it's not funny. I don't know when he goes to the bathroom, but or the water closet or whatever you call it over there. But He said in this lecture, he said, I have no idea what it even means to say memories are in the brain. I don't even know what that means. He said the brain is not the kind of thing that can have memories because, he said, everything that's in the brain has spatial extension, like your different neurons and the atoms and molecules. Even though tiny, they have spatial extension. He said memories don't have any, there's no width to a memory or shape or size. They're not extended. Now, they're about things that were extended. If you remember your grandmother, she was extended, but your memory of her isn't. So he said everything in the brain is spatially extended. Memories aren't spatially extended, so they're not in the brain. And what I do is I compare memories like grooves in a CD with music. Is the music in the CD? Well, no, there's no music in the CD. You hold it up to your ear and you can't hear a thing. What is in the CD is digitalized markings. Let's just call them grooves. Now, if the CD isn't damaged and you put it in the right retrieval system, what will the triggering of those grooves do? That will produce music in the room. Not in the CD, but in the room. So the CD contains grooves that if they're not damaged and you have a retrieval system that triggers those grooves appropriately, it will bring sound into the surrounding area. The brain is the same way. It doesn't contain memories. What happens is that memories implant grooves in the brain in the form of neurons that wire together, and that forms a little rut or a groove. When that dude is triggered, it will bring back a memory in the self. So as long as the brain isn't damaged and as long as you're in a retrieval position of trying to run through your memories, you can hit on something that will trigger that brain groove and it'll produce the memory in the self. It's not in the brain. The groove is. The storage of a groove is in the brain, but the memory itself isn't. So that's a good way to think about it.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, another thing that I hear constantly is that neuroscience has supposedly shown that the neurons in our brain which correlate to a decision-making process about an action actually get active only after the neurons get active which correlate to us executing the action. Now, and this is supposed to supposedly shows that again the brain is the mind. How do you look at that?
Well, this sort of idea began with the experiments of Benjamin Libet, who basically determined that about half a second before a person did something like wiggle their finger, there was an increase in electrical potential in the brain. Now, Libet himself admitted that this proved nothing because what he said is that you still have what's called free won't. That means after this electrical potential in the brain builds up, you still have the veto power not to wiggle your finger. So you still retain power after this buildup in the brain. The second thing that is problematic about this experiment is what's called the time lag problem, and that is that after a free decision to act occurs, there will be a very tiny interval of time between that final choice and your awareness of exercising your volitional power. So what people are recording is their awareness of exercising freedom, not the exact moment when they exercised freedom. So there's a time lag between the two. What I really think is going on in these experiments is that what is being measured by an increase in electrical activity is the person's readiness and anticipation of acting, not the choice to act. So I think what that shows is when you're deliberating and you're about to make a choice to wiggle your finger or not, you build up a sort of anticipation and a sort of a readiness to do one or the other. And that, of course, brings oxygen flow to certain regions of the brain, but it's not the choice. Now, there's one other, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, sure.
Now, there's one other thing that I think destroys this argument altogether. And this was actually advanced by Richard Swinburne in his book, Minds, Brains, and Free Will. Swinburne said that when experimenters do these experiments, they assume that when the subject says yes or no, or true or false, or they wiggle their finger, that's because they desired to accurately tell the truth to the scientist and intended to communicate the truth by wiggling the finger or by saying yes or something of that sort. If you thought that person's finger wiggling, or if the person says, "Are you choosing?" and you say yes, if you thought that sound that came out of their mouths or that body movement was deterministically caused by brute matter, then you wouldn't trust that anything they said is true, because they would be like a parrot who has been programmed to simply barf sounds that they don't know what they mean. They're just making noises when the right circumstances trigger them deterministically to make the noise. Swinburne says if we don't have free will and everything that comes out of our mouths or our body movements are merely the inexorable result of brute brain activity, where it's just a purely physical sequence of events, then there's no reason why you would ever believe that the patient that's being studied is telling the truth or not. Only if you ascribe to that person a desire to tell the truth and the intent, the freely chosen intent that what I'm about to do is to communicate truthfully something I want to tell you, do you trust their reports as accurate? So the very thesis that our behaviors are actually determined slightly ahead of time is self-refuting, because it undermines the credibility of the reports on which those theories are based.
Yeah. Or in other words, I guess neuroscientific experimentation assumes the existence of an immaterial self, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Now, another claim that, or another term that we constantly hear is the term emergent property. And it has become kind of common coin when people speak about consciousness. Both lay people and scientists, they would say, well, consciousness is an emergent property of matter. And I have a quote by Sam Harris here who puts it like this. He says, arranging atoms in a certain way appears to bring about an experience of being that very collection of atoms. That's what he says in his book, Waking Up. Now, what are we to think of this term, and what is actually meant, let's say, scientifically speaking, by emergent property?
Well, first of all, if there are such things, and I don't believe there are, but emergent properties would be a brand new kind of property that is totally different than any of the properties that characterize the base from which it emerges. And when the base reaches a certain level of combination and complexity, something entirely new that never existed before appears. So emergent properties are brute facts for which there is no explanation, scientific or otherwise. Because if you could explain why they appeared by appealing to some features of the base, the highly organized base, they would no longer be emergent. You could predict that they would occur based on your knowledge of the underlying base. But one of the characteristics of emergent properties is that they are supposed to be, in principle, unpredictable from an exhaustive knowledge of the underlying base structures. That's why they're literally brand new, and there's nothing about the base that will tell you one way or another that they should appear. The only way we learn to anticipate their appearance is by observing repeated times when matter reaches a certain level of complexity and we see the property. All right, but that is only correlating them. It doesn't explain anything whatsoever. Yeah. So I think that an appeal to emergent properties is not a solution. It's a name for the problem. It is slapping a name on what is utterly problematic. And here's what's problematic. How can you get something from absolutely nothing by just rearranging the nothing? In other words, if matter is what an ideal chemistry and physics and neuroscience tells us it is utterly bereft of consciousness or the potential for consciousness. Are you telling me that brute matter, without any potentiality for consciousness, can be rearranged and all of a sudden, presto, this whole new thing that has never existed in the history of the world until the first sentient being evolved pops into existence? No. That's getting something out of nothing. And that's what, and that problem is why more and more non-theists are moving to panpsychism. And they're abandoning strict physicalism because they acknowledge, like David Chalmers, they acknowledge that if you're a strict physicalist, you're getting something out of nothing, and that's completely impossible. So they've started saying all individual pieces of matter have their own little consciousnesses. These little attenuated, maybe not full-blown, maybe an electron isn't aware it's an electron, but it might have an awareness of attraction towards protons, for example. So then when you bring all of these little pieces of these atoms that have their own individual consciousnesses together, you get the emergent property because you're not getting something out of nothing. You're getting the actualization of something from potentiality that's already latent within matter. The problem with that, as Chalmers himself admits, that has never been solved, is the unity of consciousness. How can you get a unified being by just adding together billions of little parts that have their own consciousness? You know, there's a difference between 80,000 people watching a soccer match, each of them having their own what it is like to be aware of the soccer match from their seat. That's very different from there being one overarching unified what it is like to be aware of the soccer match that is over and above each individual member of the 80,000 people. When suppose that you brought 80,000 people together to watch a soccer match, and they all put glue on their hands, and they all held hands so that they were, for the rest of their lives, stuck together into one structure. Now we've got a structure, let's call it structure S, that's composed of 80,000 individual people. I assure you there is no what it is like to be S. There is no what it is like to watch the game from S's point of view, because there is no self over and above the individual 80,000. The same thing with panpsychism. You can't get a unified self. So emergent properties are problematic because they involve getting something for nothing, and they do not explain the unity of consciousness. You can't explain the unity of consciousness by just being a crowd, in my case a brain with billions of individual parts, each having their own visual sensation of a different part of my visual field. There's no one thing that unites it all into one experience.
Yeah. So let me just ask back on this panpsychism. Would it be accurate to say that it simply kind of scales the problem back or moves the problem back from, not talking about, an arrangement of atoms giving rise to consciousness, but simply, again, consciousness somehow being latent in, simple pieces of matter, which, again, there is no evidence for that in the first place.
Well, that's right. And no evidence whatever, but it's an attempt to try to solve the problem of the origin of consciousness without appealing to God. Because if you have in the beginning was the Logos, then you start your ontology with consciousness, with a conscious being. So you don't have any problem with how subsequent conscious beings could appear. But if you say in the beginning were the particles, you're in deep trouble. And to avoid that, you try to say, well, in the beginning were the latent conscious particles. There's no evidence for that. And in fact, it raises problems of unity and all sorts of things.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Now, I'd like to move on to talk about near-death experiences, or NDEs. Now, what exactly is an NDE, and how credible are the reports that we get, for a start?
Well, there has been a massive amount of highly technical scientific research on this for the last 20 years. What we've discovered is that there are up to 300 million of these that have been reported worldwide. In the United States, 1 out of every 25 people have had a near-death experience. That's something like 14 to 15 million people still living today who have died, left their bodies, and had an experience of heaven or hell and of God himself. And so these things aren't just small. There are a huge number of them. There are hundreds of thousands that have occurred when the brain and the body was absolutely 100% dead. There was no brain wave, no brain activity whatsoever. It lasted long enough to where the brain was not only dead, but could not be recovered. Consciousness could not be recovered, especially without damage to the brain. And what happens in a number of these cases, and these are numerous and well documented, is that people have gained knowledge of things that happen other places that are later verified by eyewitnesses, including the doctor and the nurses, that are in their medical charts that they could not have known if it had just been oxygen deprivation to the brain or a dying brain phenomenon or something like that. So, for example, there have been very clear cases. This was studied and published in a book called Mindsight by 2 PhD researchers at the University of Connecticut Medical School. So these aren't just fighting fundamentalist Christians that are trying to get their 15 minutes of fame. These are highly trained researchers. They did detailed studies on 25 people that were born completely blind.
Okay.
They'd never seen a thing in their lives. They had near-death experiences, and they saw all kinds of things that when they came back to their bodies, they lost their sight again, but they were able to describe in complete detail things they saw. For example, one person had never seen, he lived in a home for the blind. He'd never seen his roommate's face. He could feel it, but he'd never seen it. And when he came back, he was able to describe the shapes of markings that weren't raised from the skin so he could feel it, but he was able to describe patches on their face and where they were located and what shape they were. Now, they did not have terms for colors, interestingly enough, which is what I would expect. They did for shapes because they had a concept of shape. They'd felt shapes before. And man, they described the playground outside, and because they went up above the facility. And so it was documented that these people gained sight and reported accurately what they saw, and then they came back and they couldn't see again, and they were born blind. There are other people who, as a Dutch cardiologist did a study, and this was, I believe, published in The Lancet, which is the most prestigious medical journal in the UK. where he took a control group of people who died of cardiac arrest and were resuscitated and did not report having a near-death experience, with a group of 20 to 25 who died, had a cardiac arrest, did have a near-death experience, and were revived. Now, he asked both groups, of course, one at a time, to report what they saw in terms of their resuscitation efforts. The group that did not report near-death experiences got no details at all accurate. In fact, what they typically described were things that they'd seen on television, which are completely different than what really happens in the hospital. By contrast, every single person in the group that claimed to have had a near-death experience and observed what was happening reported a high number of details that were dead center and would not have been reported because they would have no way of knowing about it if they just learned from TV watching. One person described everything that happened so accurately that Von Lommel said, I could actually use this as a training tape for new physicians as to what to do when a person has a cardiac arrest. I could give you other examples, but they are numerous. And a good book to read on all of this is Evidence of the Afterlife by Jeffrey Long. And I have edited a book called The Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism. And there's a chapter in there by Gary Habermas that only recounts evidential near-death experiences, those that report evidence that were verified and couldn't have been known from just brain death.
Yeah.
But what that shows is that I can survive without my body.
Yeah. Now, sometimes when people are faced with, again, the evidence for near-death experiences, they would then turn around and say, well, why do people then have, different experiences in terms of seeing the divine or experiencing heaven or karma or nirvana or whatever? How would you respond to that?
Right. Number one, it is shocking how world over there are factors that are in common in all these experiences. So besides the fact that they differ in certain ways, they agree far more than they differ. And there are that can be documented in a number of books that have been written. The one by Jeffrey Long documents some of that, and the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences has a very detailed research on cross-cultural near-death experiences. So they still share several factors in common. Secondly, what you would be surprised at is that where they do differ, they differ not over what they experience, but the interpretation they give to their experience. So they will all, for example, claim to see a vibrant being of light of some kind. And some may interpret that as Krishna or Allah or Yahweh. And the interpretation is something they bring to the experience. It isn't part of the experience or the being's self-identification. The being doesn't say, I'm Shiva or Vishnu, except in the case of Jesus, where there are times when he does identify himself as being who he is. A second thing to keep in mind is that there are a host of cases where people in let's say, Hindu cultures, where their religion teaches them that they ought to be annihilated when they die or merge with the one and lose their personality, have experiences of a white-robed figure that's bearded that has a book of judgment that's presented that they must stand before. And it's clearly Jesus. Now, you might say, well, why would God do this without making clear to them who he was? Well, if you look in the Old Testament, there are many times when God appears to people but hides his identity from them. He doesn't let them know. that he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, why would God do that? I'll leave it to him, but I think it may be because he knows that they can only handle so much, and he's going to give them whatever light that they can handle to give them a free will chance to pursue more and to seek God more when they come back. If they don't, then that will be a basis of greater judgment for them rather than salvific. So you better be careful if you're given more revelation that you do something with it. So that would be my quick answer to that.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, is it possible to believe in the soul in the classic dualist sense and also hold to Darwinian evolution?
Yes and no. You could hold to an evolutionary account of the origin of the body, so that how the human body evolved from prior bodies through time. But there is in principle no account of the origin of consciousness or the unified self or the free agent or the soul. Darwin himself admitted that in what are called the M and N notebooks, he wrote notebooks. One was called the M notebook, the other the N notebook. And in those notebooks, he said that my theory is a purely physical theory, where I explain the origin of certain arrangements of matter from other arrangements of matter according to the laws of survival and the struggle for reproductive advantage and survival. He said, if there is anything that my theory cannot explain, and he said consciousness is one of them, and the soul is one, then you would need to appeal to an alternative explanation, and it would probably be a theistic one. And so my theory has got to be reductive. You have to reduce mind to matter, because my theory cannot even in principle explain the origin of the immaterial by simply rearranging the material. Maybe another way to put this is that evolution explains things in virtue of what's called combinatorial explanations. A combinatorial explanation is where you explain something by appealing to a new combination of pre-existing parts of some sort. So what evolution does, it explains the appearance of new structures at the macro level by appealing to mutations that occur at the micro level. Those rearrange, and that causes new traits to be manifested that are then subject to selection pressures. So that's, you explain phenotypes by recombinations of genotypes. Yeah. The problem is that explanation will work for structured things, like the body or the heart, which is a structure of myriads of parts. It doesn't explain simple things, partless things, like a feeling of pain isn't composed of a billion of parts. Yeah. It's a simple, smooth quality. Again, my visual field is simple. It's not built up out of parts. And myself, as a free individual agent, is not a composite of parts. So you can explain simple things by appealing to combinatorial explanations.
Okay, thank you. Now, to close this off, a more personal question. Why does this matter, or why does the existence of the soul matter? And what got you personally into, studying this and dedicating your research to this?
Yes. Now, first of all, the Bible seems to me to clearly teach that we have souls. And that we die, we leave our bodies and await a new resurrected body. I saw more Christians giving that up and becoming Christian physicalists. And I was suspicious that this was driven by alleged pressure from neuroscience. So I decided to say, well, do I really need to give this up? And the more work I did on it, the more I realized, well, no, not at all. Secondly, when you begin to lose belief in the soul, the culture starts losing belief in life after death. There have been attempts by physicalists to come up with Christian physicalists to come up with a plausible account of life after death, as purely physicalists, but I find them all radically unpersuasive. And obviously, the most natural way to make room for life after death is if I can survive when my body's deteriorating in the ground. And so I must be a spirit of some kind. The other thing is free will. If Harris is right, and all we are emergent properties caused by the brain, then there's no free will, as he himself admits. But then how can you hold somebody responsible for not being an atheist if they didn't choose to be a theist in the first place? It makes the very idea of debating a topic presupposes that you think your arguments can persuade people to choose to change their minds, and they're not determined by their brain chemistry. It's ridiculous. Harris's argument is contradictory. So if you're your brain and central nervous system, Lucas, I got news for you. Everything you do is either going to be determined or its probabilities fixed by matter and matter only. There is no room for active exercises of volitional power. So these were some of the reasons that I felt like this was important. Plus, you have an argument for God's existence, because if you go from finite consciousness, the best explanation for it is not panpsychism, but that there was an original infinite consciousness that created finite consciousness. So you get an argument for God's existence.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Moreland, for these very helpful and clear explanations. Guys, if you enjoyed this, then please subscribe. Please also let us know by commenting, and check out JP Moreland's website, jpmoreland.com, where you can learn about his books and writings and his work. It's well worth to check it out. And thank you again, Dr. Moreland, for being with me and for sharing from your research and experiences. Thank you so much.
Lucas, it's been my privilege.
Thank you.